Hey guys, so in this tutorial I'm going to cover using event dispatchers to communicate between a widget blueprint and an actor blueprint, like so. With this door, I've created an interactable door with a menu. When you click on the door, you can open it, close it, break the door, and that's all using event dispatchers to communicate between the widget blueprint and the door blueprint. Okay, so let's start by creating our widget blueprint. We'll go to user interface and then widget blueprint, and I'm going to call this widget blueprint door pop-up. Now opening this will bring you to the designer tab, and I first want to draw your attention to the top right hand screen corner of the screen, and you'll see the fill screen option. Now fill screen stretches, or at least tries to fit, the widget to the screen size, and we don't want to do that. We want to create a custom on-screen widget, and that will give you two options to set the width and the height of the widget, and we're just going to set it to something like 200 by 200. Now over on the canvas we want to add a new vertical box and then align it back to 0, 0, and then set its size to the size that we set for our widget. Now I'm going to add the 3 buttons and text components. Alright, now our first button is going to be open door. The second button will be break door. And lastly, we need an escape for our players, so we're going to call this last one cancel. Now before we get into any code, we need to add the events for the buttons. And if you click on each of the buttons and then scroll down to the bottom of the details panel, you'll see the events component, and we just want to create an on-clicked event for each button. So we want to do that for all 3, just like that. Right, so we've got our 3 button events here. We won't be needing these disabled nodes, so that's fine to delete them. Now for the interesting part. For communication between HUD elements and normal blueprints, we use event dispatchers as one option, and I'm going to create 3 of those. The first of which I'm going to call open door. The second will be break door, and lastly I'll call this one option selected. Now the option selected event is going to be called by all 3 buttons, and what it's going to do is it's going to execute logic to remove the widget from the screen whenever you select a button. So the cancel button, which is this event here, will only execute option selected. It won't need to execute any other event dispatcher, but our open and break door events will obviously call these 2 before it calls option selected. So if you hold down left click and drag the event dispatcher in to the graph, we then select the call option and hook those up. And lastly, I'll drag the option selected and hook all 3 of them up to this last one here. To create a reroute node on any line, just double click it and it will create a reroute node. Great. So our logic for this is when the button is clicked, we will call the event dispatcher, which later on we will then bind to this event dispatcher so that we can receive the execution when it gets executed. And then lastly call the option selected event dispatcher, which, like I said earlier, will be used to remove the widget from the screen. Now before we get into creating our actual door blueprint, we want to create a few variables for our event dispatchers to pass along when they get executed. So if you select an event dispatcher, in the details panel on the left hand side you'll see inputs and the new button. Now this is essentially the same as creating any variables for a function or blueprint. So we'll click new, and I'm going to call this new variable message and set it to a string. And I'm going to do the same for break door. There seems to be a bug too with this current version that I'm using, which is 4.8.3, and that is if you've already got an event dispatcher call node set out, the new variables won't take on your selected variable name. So all you need to do is right click on the node and call refresh node, and it will set it back to what it needs to be. So the message we want to pass along, or the value of our variable, the variable can be anything, but we're going to use a message, and I'm going to say you opened the door for our open door event dispatcher, and then you broke the door for our break door event dispatcher. And we can compile and save that. And that's all we need for the widget blueprint. So now we can move on to our door blueprint itself. So I'm going to right click, create a new blueprint class of type actor, and call it blueprint interactable door, and open that up. Now to start with, I'm going to create a new scene component and call it root and set it as the default scene. I just like to do that, it makes it look more neat. Now we want to add our static meshes for our door and our door frame. So if you come over here to the static mesh component and search for door, there will be the door frame and our door static mesh that came with the starter content that we added at the beginning of the project. Now we just need to align this up, and I think it is 45, yep. There, we've got our visual representation of our door, and we need to add a box collision component and call it trigger volume. And we're going to be using this volume to determine whether the player is within range to start interacting with our door. I'm going to set it to a black and make it visible in-game, and I'm just going to give it an approximate size of the door. Doesn't have to be perfect. That looks alright. Okay. One thing to note, if you have added the starter content, the starter content door, static mesh door, by default does not come with collision. So the easiest way to add collision, and you do need collision to be able to receive click events on the static mesh. So the on-clicked event won't work unless there is collision on the static mesh. So to add collision to a static mesh, the easiest way, at least in the Unreal Engine, you can also add it as part of like Maya or wherever you created the static mesh. But the easiest way is we're going to browse to it in the content browser and we're going to open it in the editor. Now I've already added collision to the static mesh and it's just going to be a simple box, but I'll show you quickly how to do that. So I'm going to go to collision and I'm going to remove my original collision, and there's no collision there now. So to add collision, because this is a simple static mesh, it's basically just a box. So we're just going to add a box simplify collision and it will create that for us. The only problem with this is that it's going to be a little too large, so we might just scale it down with the scale tool. And you can also move around your collision within the static mesh as well as scale it and rotate it, but I'm just going to leave it as default but scaled it down, and then click save. So now you should have collision on the default static mesh that came with the starter content. Right, now that we've got that, we need to add a few events to be able to interact with our door. So I'm going to use the trigger volume and I'm going to create the two component begin and end overlap events to our graph by simply just clicking on our trigger volume and adding the events like that. And there they are. We don't need the disabled nodes, so you can remove them. Alright, so now we need to ask ourselves what type of logic we need to start building. So what are the rules for our player to start interacting with the door? They need to be within the trigger volume, so within range essentially, and they also need to start clicking on the door to be able to bring up the HUD or the widget blueprint and use it to open the door. So on our begin overlaps, I'm going to create a new variable of type boolean and call it is player within range, and compile that so that it appears. And then I'm going to set that variable on these two events. And to set without having to drag and then select, we just hold left click, drag it over, hold Alt, and that will automatically set. And similar with get, if you hold left click, drag, and hold Control, it will get the value instead of set. So I'm going to hook those up. So when the player is overlapping our trigger volume, we want to set is player within range to true, and that will tell us that the player can then start to interact with the door. Right, now we want to be able to create an event when the player clicks on our door. So I've selected the door static mesh, come down to the bottom where the events component is, and I've added the onClicked event here. Now the first thing we want to do is to check if the player is within range. So I'm going to create a new branch, and how I did that is hold B and then left click, and that's a shortcut to create a branch. Now I'm going to get our is player within range variable and hook it up to the branch. So now when the player is within range and they've clicked on the door, we can execute some logic based on that. Now the next step we want to do after that is we want to check if we already have our widget created. Now I know that seems kind of counterintuitive as seeing we haven't even created the widget yet, but that's a question we have to ask so that we don't run into a problem where we're constantly creating the widget and destroying it. So I'm going to add a new variable here and call it is widget active. Compile that so that it appears, and I'm going to create a new branch, paste that onto true, and there we have it. So now when the player clicks on the door, we're checking if they are within range, and then if the widget is currently active. So if the widget is currently active, we don't really need to do anything because it's actually on the screen and the player can interact with its menu. But if it isn't active, then we need to create it and then store it so that we can access it later. So what we want to do is we need to create a new variable, and we're going to call it our widget popup, and it's going to be of type widget blueprint and our widget door pop-up, like that. Now what we want to do, again this seems counterintuitive, but we want to check if it is valid with a boolean and in a branch. So if our variable that is holding our widget blueprint is valid, then we know that we've already created it in the past and we don't need to create it again. So if it is valid, then we just need to re-add it to the screen for the player to be able to interact with it. But if it isn't valid, then we know that we haven't created it yet and that we should move on to do that. So let's do that now. Let's create our widget with the create widget node, and we can select the class using this drop down and select our widget door pop-up. Now I've already created one earlier, so I've got two, and I'm just going to select it there. Now we should set the owning player to the player controller, so I'm just going to get player controller there. Now next we get a return value, and that is the widget blueprint itself, and we're going to set it to our variable that we created earlier, and I'm just going to drag and drop that onto the return value, and it's going to create a set node for us. So now this previous step makes a little more sense. So now that we've created the widget and we've set it to the variable is now valid, and then it will return to true if we execute our onClicked again. We need to add a few custom events to be able to execute our logic when we interact with the menu that gets created with our widget blueprint. So down below here I'm going to add a custom event, and I'm going to call this add widget, like that. Now in our add widget custom event, it's going to get executed when our widget is valid, right here, add widget, and after we've created and set our widget blueprint as well as bound our event dispatches to custom events that we will create later. So I'm going to add the logic for our add widget event. So what do we need to do when we want to add the widget? We want to know where the player has clicked on the door so that we can create the widget at that position, and then we want to add the widget to the viewport so that it is visible. So how do we do that? So I'm going to get our widget pop-up, and I'm going to call set the position in viewport. So when that gets called, it's going to set the position of the widget pop-up to whatever value we decide. And that is going to be our mouse position. So to get the mouse position, all we need to do is get the player controller, drag off there, and then get mouse position. And that gets it as an X and Y coordinate. Now we could simply split the pin structure here and add them like that. Or I could create a new vector 2D, drag those together, and then bring that position up there. And there we have it. We've got our mouse position, and we're setting the widget's position to that location. The next thing we need to do in our add widget is we need to finally simply add it to the viewport. And I'm going to do that over here. I'm going to drag off our widget pop-up and add to viewport. And drag that together. So now we've set the position of our widget pop-up and then added it to the viewport. And there's one last step we need to do. So because we're calling the add widget custom event, which as the name suggests adds the widget to the viewport, we need to then finally set our boolean that controls if the widget is active. Because we've added it, it needs to be set to true because the widget is active. And that's it for our add widget component. Now the next custom event we want to create, I'm going to add a new custom event and I'm going to call it remove widget. And again, it's going to do simply exactly what it says. I'm going to get our widget pop-up and I'm going to remove from parent. And that removes the widget from the viewport because it's parented to the viewport when we add it to the viewport. And just like we set is widget active to true when we add the widget, we need to set it back to false when we remove it. So it's just set to false, not true, false. And that's it for our remove widget. Now here comes the interesting part where we can pass variables from our HUD or our widget blueprint to our door blueprint. And we do that by binding to our event dispatchers in our pop-up widget blueprint. And we're going to do that when we create the widget blueprint. So after we set the widget blueprint to our pop-up variable, we need to pull off from here and then call our, and then search for bind, and that gives us a few options. So you'll see that you can bind to our event dispatchers, and here's our 3 event dispatchers that we created in our widget blueprint. There's the option selected, open door and break door event dispatchers. So we need to bind to all 3 of those, and you simply select the one you want to bind to, So I just bind to option selected, now bind to open door, now bind to break door as the last one. And there we go. So now you'll notice that it has a little event variable that we need to fill in. And what that is asking for is for a custom event delegate. Now you'll see above our custom events, they have the little red box, which is a delegate, which is used to execute this event remotely. And that's what our bind to our event dispatcher does. So if I grab our remove widget, which if you remember earlier in the video, I talked about whenever we select an option in our widget blueprint, we want to remove it. We want to remove the widget blueprint from the screen automatically. And subscribing to this event dispatcher is how we do that. So we drag our delegate off our remove widget custom event and put it into our option selected bind node. So when we receive the event, when the button gets clicked, it's going to then execute this custom event node here. And I'm just going to clean that up. And remember, if you double click, you'll create a reroute node. So you can probably see where this is going. We need to create 2 more custom events for our open door and our break door. So let's do that now. I'm going to create a custom event, open door, and another custom event called break door. Now, if you remember, in our widget blueprint, our call option selected event dispatcher does not have any variables or any inputs. But our open and our break door have a string input on each of them. Now this is very important when you're binding a custom event to an event dispatcher that has variables. It needs to have the same variables on the custom event. So if I take our open door custom event, which has no inputs, and try to attach it to our bind event to open door, it won't work, because our open door custom event does not have the same variable signatures. So what I mean by variable signature is that the event dispatcher has a message variable and we need to add that to our custom event. So if I add a new input, and I'm just going to call it the same, the name is irrelevant. The name can be the same, it could be different, but the important part is that it needs to be the same type. So it needs to be a string. So now that I've added a string variable to our custom event, I can drag our delegate and attach it to our open door bind event. And just with the remove widget event, whenever we call the open event dispatcher here, because we've bound to that, it will then call the custom event that we've set. So let's just simply print our message like that, and we'll clean that up, make it look nice and neat. And we need to do the same for our break door. Now again, dragging the delegate off and trying to attach it to the event bind won't work because we haven't created the signature correctly. So I need to add a new variable of type string, and then I can drag it and attach it, and that will work there. And I'm just going to do the same. We're going to print the string and clean up our wires like that. I'm just going to compile to get rid of those messages. So there we go. So we've created our event dispatchers, which are going to pass the execution to any event that binds to those event dispatchers. And that's these ones here. We've bound their delegates to those events. Now, one problem we have now is that by default the player controller does not receive click events. So we need to do that. So when we overlap our trigger volume, we want to set the player controller to receive click events. So set enable click events, and that's just a set boolean. So when the player overlaps our trigger volume, we want to set it so that the controller can receive click events, and we'll set that to true just there. Now we need to do the same for when the player leaves the trigger volume. We want to set it to enable click events, but we want to set it back to false. And as well, by default, the player controller, as you might know, the cursor is not visible by default. So we want to also set mouse cursor, set show mouse cursor. And we want to enable that when the player overlaps the trigger volume. And again, when they leave the trigger volume, we want to disable that so that the mouse cursor gets hidden. And that should be it for our overlapping of our volume. And lastly, before we test out what we've done so far, we need to follow our chain here after we've created our widget and bound our event dispatchers to our custom events that we've created down here to execute our logic to start opening the door or breaking it. We then need to add the widget to the viewport, because when our widget isn't valid, we need to create it, and we haven't added it to the viewport at the end of our logic chain here. So I'm just going to call add widget function here. And that's going to simply add it to the viewport for us, as we created earlier. Now I'm going to compile and test that out. So I'm going to drag our interactable door out into the world, and that should be it here. And then I'm going to play. Now you should see our mouse appears when we come within the volume, and it disappears when we go out of the volume. And that will enable us to click on our door. So if I click on our door when we're inside the volume, it should appear our widget pop-up at the mouse position. And because it's already active, I can't click and create it anywhere else until I select an option. So if I select cancel, it will simply make our widget disappear, and then I can click again. Now our two options for open door and break door will execute our logic to display the message that we passed along with our event dispatcher. So you remember we called our event dispatcher with the message you opened the door, and the same with break the door, you broke the door. And those messages are getting passed along with our custom events when we bind to those event dispatchers. So break door, you broke the door. Open door, you opened the door. And when I click cancel, it just closes the pop-up. Now currently we don't have any logic to actually open the door, so let's do that now. So I'm going to come back to our door blueprint, and we want to add logic to open the door. So what do we need? We need a new variable of type boolean, and we want to call it isDoorOpen, so that we know to either close the door or open the door. And I'm going to get that and pass it into a branch. And then off our branch, we need to set it. So if the door is open, we want to set door is open to false. But if our door is not open, we want to set it to true, because we are opening the door. If we want to open the door and the door is currently closed, we want to set it to true to say that we have opened the door. And I'm going to use a timeline to open the door. So if we right click in the graph and search for timeline, at the bottom you should be able to add a timeline. And I'm going to call this door open timeline. So when we open the door, if the door is open, so this is when the door is open, we want to reverse. And when the door is closed and we want to open it, we want to play. Now how do we use this? How do we use a timeline? If you double click on a timeline, it will bring you to the timeline graph. And we want to create a new function. And I'm just going to call it door open. Now timelines are great for creating simple changes in variables over time. So we simply want to add a new key, and if you right click on the graph editor, you'll get the add key option. And we want to set our first key to time of 0 and its value of 0. So it's going to be our starting key. And we really only need one. We really only need to want two keys, and that's our starting key and our ending key. Now our ending key, we will set our time to 0.5. So it's going to take 0.5 seconds for our door to open or close. And we want to set the value to 90. Now the value, as time changes, it's going to interpolate from 0 to 90, and we're going to use that to angle the rotation of the door. So from 0 it's going to angle out to 90 and open, or when it's in reverse it's going to go from 90 back to 0. Now one thing to note, because we have two keys, there's this option here to use the last keyframe. So when we hit the last keyframe, the timeline's going to stop. Otherwise, it will just keep on going. So we want to use the last keyframe. And I'm just going to compile that there and go back to our event graph. Now you'll see we get a new float called door open, and that's our function here. Now how do we use that to open the door? So I'm going to get our door component, and I'm going to set the relative rotation of our door. And I'm going to drag that off update. Now we need to provide this node with a rotation. So how do we go from float to a rotation? Because we only want to change the yaw value, we pull off our door open value to the yaw value when we make a rotation, because our pitch and our roll only want to stay at 0 or their original values. And then we can just drag that onto there, and I'll just pull that out, make it look a little bit neater. And there we go. We should now be able to open the door. I'm going to compile and play. Now if I click on the door, select open door, it will open and close as part of our timeline. And that's probably the hardest part about this tutorial, is understanding how a timeline works. So when we want to open the door, when we want to close the door, we need to reverse our timeline, which reverses its rotation, essentially from 90, which is this keyframe here, its value is 90, back to our original keyframe, which is 0. Alright, so let's finish with our break door. So what do we want to do with break door? You could add some interesting explosion effects and all those sort of things, but essentially the end result is our door's going to disappear. So I'm going to drag our door component, our static mesh, into the event graph, and I'm just going to destroy component. Like that. And that's all there is to it. So if I go back to our door, select our break door, it's going to disappear. We broke the door. And you could, like I said, add some interesting explosions or sounds to go along with that. But essentially all we wanted to do was break the door. And we can do that even while the door is open. And the door's gone. It's broke. Once it's broke, it's not coming back. Right, so to recap, what we've done is we've created our widget blueprint for our pop-up, for our menu. We've created event dispatchers that are going to pass the execution of our button events to our door blueprint. And we passed some message variables along with those. In our door blueprint, we've used the trigger volume to check if the player was within range and has clicked the door. If the widget was active, we don't want to create anything else. If the widget is already active, we don't really want to do anything else. But if it isn't, we want to check if we have already created the widget in the past. And if we have, we just want to simply add the widget back to our viewport. But if we haven't, we want to create the widget, set the widget to our variable reference, and then bind the events to our custom events so that they can receive that execution when the buttons are pressed in the menu. And then we can execute our custom logic for whatever you wanted to do for the door. You could have it slide up or down like a garage door, or have two doors open sideways like an elevator, and that can all be changed simply within this event right here. And that's all there is to it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave a message down the bottom of the YouTube video, or you can contact me on email or Skype, or even on the UE4 forums.